Marcus is on work. He was at town hall.
Oh, is it okay?
I had a meeting with the superintendent last week. He texted me, I'm at PSAP, I'm on my way. It's like, now, it's all those years on Zoom.
Yes, so many buildings, so many options.
Office.
So many options.
Yeah.
We're live, Mary.
Hi, Marion. How are you? Sure.
All right, select your numbers. I'm passing a card. It's going with something for
Got it.
the manager's office people tomorrow. I feel like I'm sitting on the floor in this chair.
Yeah, the black can be burned.
There's a little lever on the right.
That might be too high, but it'll be way better than it was.
Marcus. Morning, how are you? Good.
We're live, Marcus.
All right, so call this meeting to order. The purpose of today is to review our existing goals, get an update on these goals, and then we do have some possible other additions to the goal list that were provided by Mr. Matthews that we can go over after we go through the existing goals. So with that, I think Kate can turn it over to you. You want to just go through them? Is that the best way, one by one?
Sure. So 1.1 is funding for Richfield demolition, which we received at the October 21 town meeting. Board approved me and Barry Dulong to be the PVC user reps, and they have begun, they had their first meeting and they've begun working on the project. So we expect the work to occur probably next summer. Related one is the Ridgehill Nike Assessment Phase 2. We do have funding available for further study, and we were going to draft, we will be drafting a committee charge and composition. This one got put behind the potential of acquiring property on Charles River Street, so that is something that's we've been doing before this, so this will probably come after that decision. Decision thought otherwise, we DPW building refresh. This is in the current 5-year capital plan under tier 2. It is my expectation that we will be able to recommend that because I do think that it's critical to the facility planning. What it would do is it would take the very comprehensive DPW study that essentially landed on a building on 470 with satellite buildings, including the one that we built, the JCB building, and decide whether now that we've sort of had the experience of COVID and working in different shifts and working out of different places, the underlying premise that it needs to all be on the same site may be changed. We don't have a lot of other sites, but certainly looking at the possibility, because this was a $50 million project, seeing as whether there could be phased aspects to this. The next decision to this would be whether we can fund it as tier 2, and then it would be a town meeting vote in May. We'd get going on it next year.
And that $60,000 number that came, is that a new number or is that what was put in the plan years ago for that? I'm just making sure.
This is a new appropriation.
Okay,
Yeah.
new appropriation.
To do a new, essentially a follow-on study now that we've done some of the work.
Got it.
Anticipate, well, I would say, Mr. Chair, under 1.3, this is the first of many times that I'd probably say that we're short in engineering, and we're short by 30 years of institutional memory of
Sure.
our friend Tony. So it's going to put a lot of our projects a little bit back on their heels.
Yeah.
The Planning Board's Affordable Housing Study Committee, we have 2 members on it, and there've been at least 2 meetings, is that correct?
Dan, do you mind updating us just briefly on?
Sure. I think that it's a, you know, they've got the 12 of the 13 spots have filled. They got good staff support. It's a big study area. I think there's part of what they're doing is to try is working on a refresh of the 2007 study, but as I reported to the board the other night, I think one of the things some of us have encouraged is the idea of identifying some specific action recommendations that might be referred to the planning board. And because it's not all of them, for example, the housing authority reconstruction isn't really under the jurisdiction of the planning board, but this committee is. So they could then report that out to those committees, and some would come back to this board. And they're working now on putting together trying to get some public input and trying to frame the best way to do that, and looking to have some meetings and possibly a community survey that the public information officer is helping with, getting that out early in the new year.
Thank you. I know Mayor Mark, you're on as well. Anything to add on that, or do you feel?
I think we got a decent ways to go, and I think Dan did a good job kind of summarizing. Gonna be some patience, but where we can push forward sooner than later, we will.
Marianne?
So I know Ms. McKnight is actually here in the audience listening today, and I know that we're also not in charge of this study, but I would have said that it would not be my expectation that this committee be rewriting the 2007 plan. I would hope that this committee is sort of focused on things that might inform somebody sitting down and rewriting the 2007 plan, but just some of those underlying pieces, like the work that needs to be done around ADUs, the work that needs to be done around transit-oriented districts around our spine, some of those pieces that could be really helpful for this discussion, just focusing there. So just a comment.
If you wish me to respond, I will.
Sure, it's informal, so, but I don't, yes, that's fine.
Because it is the intention of, it is the work plan that a draft update of the housing plan be issued by the, essentially it would be by the planning board ultimately. And then, the draft plan would be, of course, the subject of comment by other boards, in particular the select board. So that is the goal.
Great, thank you for that.
And one thing I think that we've had a lot of discussion in the community over the last year, but people's attention tends to move back to other things. So one thing I've said to all of the stakeholders is, look, the meetings of this committee are in the YouTube library. And I encourage people to watch them, and they can watch them at higher speed, as we say, so it doesn't take the full 2 hours, but this stuff tends to get very complicated very quickly with a lot of different sub-issues involved in it. If people, individual citizens want to have, or groups want to have an impact on decision-making in this area, that we can build the kind of community consensus that we need to make those decisions and act on them, then it's important for them to follow the process and get their input in early. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, RTS.
So the board asked for us to consider sort of the overall solid waste delivery model. So that is something that we would be looking at again, whether we should be committing financial resources as a drop-off community, or whether we should be looking again at whether it would make sense for Needham to be a curbside community. And then that's the long-term view, but also there may be operational efficiencies in the short term. And we're looking at proposals relating to which days the facility is staffed, for instance, on overtime versus being staffed on a full-time basis. So those would be included in a funding request that was a what we call a DSR 5, a request for a warrant article, because it's not capital. That would be in our budget recommendation to you next month.
And I know it's a long discussion we're gonna have on curbside. We feel differently. I think might feel differently on that, but as far as the efficiencies, I think that's a good start. And we feel that that's time sensitive enough for this request, right? You'll slot in fine. Okay.
Well, I think the driver is there's a lot of capital needs at the facility. And so if it were to be a drop-off facility only for recyclables, or, there would be very different investment than if you continue the model that we have now. So I think the decision was made to keep the community at drop-off in the sort of mid to late 90s. And I think certainly probably a 50% turnover, in residents. And so we should be looking at that decision again. And if the decision is to be a drop off, and then we can start planning for those investments.
Got it.
Also, litter in general, we did look at a household trash bylaw. The board looked at that and asked that we put that on the warrant for May. So we will be doing that. It doesn't have much real action other than you could point to it and say it's not allowed to put your household trash in the trash barrel. But we're also looking at other ways that we can tackle the trash issue, and some of those might be through funding requests that are included in Public Works and Parks and Recreation, including additional laborers and park ranger positions that we could take a look at. So you will see more from us in our budget recommendation. There's 138,000 for 2 park rangers in the budget requested from the department, and there's additional funding actually in the DPW.
Great. I love that request.
These are both things that are included in as really called out in your budget priorities, because there's so much community desire for the trash situation to be resolved, and modifying behavior doesn't seem to be working. But we're all ears if there are ideas. We actually think Kara's talked to you about our pilot idea, which we would take one area where we would put an enormous number of barrels and another where we would turn it a carry in, carry out, and see which was more successful. So, do they identify the locations around here?
Greens and I believe here.
Yeah, so this one would get the barrels and greens would be carry in, carry out.
You say carry and carry out, you just mean like
No
No,
barrels.
no
no
barrels,
barrels at all.
like all the state parks.
So what would be there instead?
Nothing.
Oh, nothing at all.
The town of Natick did this, and
Yeah.
the park with no barrels was much cleaner than the park. with-
Really? I'm gonna see how soccer goes, Saturday soccer and things like that. That's all I'm thinking about. I'm like, okay, Saturday soccer, will we step up to the challenge? And I hope so.
And the nice thing about Saturday soccer is there's a captive audience if you explain it. you
Very
know,
true,
and they bring
very true.
bags and have bags, I don't know.
If we do that, I'll
Soccer coaches.
definitely reach out to the Y and let them know, like, we gotta do better.
Yeah, we'll have a lot of marketing. at the
Yeah.
Working with stakeholders to manage the impact of COVID-19. I didn't think this would be another year, but clearly it is. We have been, as the board knows, you approved an initial budget for our ARPA funding, and we have hired an epidemiologist, a public health nurse. We're looking at, we have contact tracers on, at least for now. And we'll be increasing staffing and services in youth and family services starting in January.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about testing, or is that still preliminary?
So I think it was last week, the state announced that they had purchased and were distributing rapid antigen tests to a number of communities based on the percent of poverty in that community. Needham was not a recipient of those, but the second thing the state's doing is getting contracts in place with rapid test manufacturers. There's 10 approved right now. So they have an open procurement process that's pending. And once they get contracts in place, municipalities will be able to purchase directly, hopefully at a much lower negotiated rate per test. So we are looking into opportunities sooner than that to purchase tests and get them out the doors. But it'll also be a longer term strategy, particularly if the state gets good contracts in place that we can go off of.
We'll have more to report on the more immediate. We're trying to see if we can find a way to get some testing out there for this holiday season, but we're working on that. So.
Can we have Tim come in
Oh,
in
that's right.
January sometime? with the-
Just about to say.
Oh, yeah.
I had my hand up, I was ready.
Tim will
Okay,
be back in
He's
January.
back.
Yeah.
He'll be
Yeah.
back in January.
okay.
Yeah.
Should be good to get.
We actually talked about getting it on the 11th. We actually have it already on.
Oh, great,
And
okay.
that's our first one. Okay.
Yeah.
I think our town is eager to hear one way or another, just, how good we are doing, but in relation to, mask mandates and what people are asking, what should we do? I think having Tim kind of explain that further and where we stand as a town in comparison to Boston or other places will be beneficial.
Well, there's no doubt it's gonna look different on January 11th. than
Even it
looks
is,
today. so,
absolutely.
Yeah, we had a couple of weeks of lower numbers. I don't know if we had last week's.
It ticked up a bit.
It took it.
Yeah.
Okay.
At 1.8, seek funding for school administration buildings. So October town meeting approved the funding for the design, and the funding for the construction is in the capital plan that you're asking you to finalize.
Tomorrow night. If we
Yeah,
had that
tonight.
tonight too,
Tonight.
that's supposed to be a day.
I got 1.9 is identify funding for school master plan projects and participate in the planning process. So we are awaiting the master plan study extension work. Matt, are you involved in that committee at all?
No.
No. So we'll be waiting to hear from them, and then in the springtime, we'll be developing the facility financing plan options. If there are other
So it's-
options that are
Right, this is looking at Mitchell and Pollock.
at High Rock, essentially.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Almost.
Review Cheney Street zoning. You recall the town meeting sent this back to the select board and the planning board. We've asked the planning board, and we're waiting for their guidance. If we can do on that.
Okay. That's an interesting one. I know it was referred back, and I guess we'll have to see if the planning board feels of that, but almost seems like it would be an overlay zone potentially or something instead of total change in zoning. I think people were understanding that there were constraints on the properties because of the SRA, but I don't think they want to go as far as changing it to allow for more development. But that was just the impression I got, because it's up to the planners to hear more.
So we'll ask them again in the winter, just feel an obligation if it's been said to us that we should do
Great.
something.
Yes, Dan.
We had, we just came off of our joint session with the planners, and I'm kind of regretting that we, in the pace of getting everything together, there are two items in our agenda, in our goals that we didn't include in that joint session. And this is one of them, and the other is whether or not they're to share views on Chestnut Street redevelopment, and hopefully, everybody's got plenty to do, but if there were an opportunity for another joint session, it would be good to get together and cover those two. And if not, then maybe some other informal chairs meeting or whatever that might address those. And then just to footnote this, because I was involved in our presentation on this issue before, which resulted in referral to this board, to the planners and the FinCom to recommend. It had to do in part with the idea, with all of the attention on housing issues. This one, people need to understand that, if this is my point of view, that we need to think carefully about how the decisions that we make are going to play out. And my thinking is, if that what was presented was simply to increase the allowed the petition simply increase the allowed density in that, which at least to me did not serve the public interest. But as I think you were saying, Matt, there are some problems that they have with the unique zoning there, that if an overlay could allow them to have setback relief that wouldn't be disruptive, that would be one outcome. Or frankly, and tying back to our affordable housing study, if people really wanted to do something that allowed greater density down there, well, then let's talk about it in a context that has some kind of affordability impact that helps people, not just say, let's create more quarter-acre lots that people can build out with the way that some of our other constituents do nothing, are very unhappy to see so much of here. So
I agree. It might be an opportunity for almost like a pilot to do something there and see how that would work if we had looked at your development there. So.
Yeah. I haven't heard anything about the petitioners refiling.
No.
So it may be something that's not going to require any immediate action, but is something. I think a lot of the members were not, with all the other things they were working on, that one was kind of well under the radar for a lot of the participants, and with zoning, that should not happen. Thank you.
I'm sorry, you were talking about Chestnut Street, or change.
Well, Chestnut Street is another one that
Talking
we,
about change.
Okay.
yeah, we had, yeah, in Chestnut. So I'll save talking about it when we get to Chestnut Street. In Chestnut Street, we have a goal in here that says, let's look at that zoning. Well, of course, that's under the planners too. And if we have another session with them, we should talk about how we view that. No, if I said that in this context, no, I was only talking about Cheney and Hunting.
Gotcha.
Thank you.
ARPA?
Right, so the board adopted the initial ARPA funding proposal. We talked a little bit earlier about what we were using for the COVID relief. We are also looking at funding for improvements to our buildings to allow better access to Wi-Fi and remote work. We are engaged in the Norfolk County portal, and we'll be submitting our first grant application to that one, which is the Walker Pond improvements. And we're meeting next week to work out our strategies for reporting. I'd like to have probably a bi-monthly report to the board. Just, what we've been spending and what projects are in the queue, and, just in accounting. We take very seriously that every dollar has to be spent on the right category of ARPA, because you've seen communities that have had CARES funds clawed back because of reporting. So our town accountant will be helping us with that. All the things we've done in health so far have been payroll related. So those are in a lot of ways easy for us to track. We can just put that out. So we will be keeping you updated on the funding. And Amy issued the economic development grant program, and I think it went out late last week.
It went out on Friday. We're gonna do a big push though, right after the new year, just when folks have time to pay attention to it, but it is available.
She already had 2 applications on Friday afternoon, so.
Oh, terrific.
Yes, so that's very exciting that that's, and if we'll have a sense if, like Katie says, if it's a big push in January and we're overwhelmed, we could come back to the board and modify the ARPA uses perhaps.
As far as internally and accounting and logistics, how much of a burden is this for the town? Is it difficult to track and understand what category? I'm just trying to think
The,
the burden on us.
well, clearly there is an extra administrative role because we have to report everything third party in the manner that they want us to report it. But we definitely have the capability and have done so with the CARES funding. So it's an extra level of administrative work, but very doable.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. I think we did 2.1, other than to say the CEA has been working on recommendations as well. And, you know, probably, as you say, get another meeting with the planning board and then work on next steps in terms of talking. I've talked informally to stakeholders on Chestnut Street, so let's see. How that goes. We're not actively working on that one. Sure. I've reported on 2.2 already, which is the small business grants. We talked about expanding snow removal efforts. Karis will have to be at your meeting tomorrow night to talk about snow removal in general and the results of their evaluation. So we'll see what happens with that. Proposals for outside seating, the town meeting adopted the zoning. Can you give an update on where the process is for the complicated applications?
Yes, so we have mapped out all the likely applicants and who would need planning board versus select board approval. Most need both. And so for the majority of applicants, they'll go to the planning board first and then we'll come to the select board, either if they're on public property or have a liquor license change. So Alex Klee and Miles have been meeting up front with people we know that are interested in applying to basically walk them through the process that's because it's specific to each person. So I'd just say in summary, the first year will be a heavier kind of administrative list for them and for us. And then moving forward, the renewals will be much more simple and less onerous on both sides.
So we might have to have in one of our meetings, a real window dedicated to this flurry of applications to be separated.
Yeah, and I think we'll know early in the new year what that might look like for this board. Once we have all the applications in and have a sense of the planning board's timeline. They have notice requirements and hearing that are more prescriptive time-wise.
Is there also a rolling application?
There is a rolling application, although we communicated to restaurants that if they want to be ready for April 1, particularly if they have a liquor license, that they really need to be talking to us now, which is why we proactively reached out to them to say as much. So nobody will miss a window. It's just whether they'll be ready to go April 1 or not.
I just had a question. As of now, are all the outdoor dining kind of done with, or any still up as far as spaces, or is everything closed and put away and we're done for the season?
So
Even
the
private and public spaces.
Yeah, the on-street park that's got pulled for December 1, so just so we can keep the streets plowed and cleared. Anyone that was not on the street had an option to keep it if they wanted. So like last winter, a number of places, the Chapel Street lot or on private property stayed open year round. They have the ability, if they so chose, to continue that this year, because we're still under COVID rules until April.
Until April of next year. And how does that affect other businesses that don't have that ability to do that from an equity standpoint? Has that been received, or how's that been on your end with?
I'd say largely people are understanding, just given the safety priority of plowing.
Okay.
Great. Moving on.
3.1. It's money for a parking study that will evaluate parking reductions and types of businesses. This is one that is also been submitted as a DSO5 in the FY23 budget request, and you'll see that in our budget presentation to you. This is really aimed at looking at not just, I mean, there may be recommendations on whether we have the best payment strategy, but also it was always the case in really recent memory that elimination of even a single parking space was to be avoided at all costs. And I think some of those theories have changed in terms of we've been able to have parklets. And if there are different priorities that we wanted to do with particularly our downtown, that might either widen sidewalks or add lanes, or reduce lanes. The parking study would take a look at what the real need is and what the options are, so.
I like the idea. I just would want to make sure we're not premature as far as COVID, that we look at it and then in future years, things change pretty quickly. So hopefully by the time it gets going, we'll be out of this.
And it's a really interesting point, whether people will want to eat outside again in the future. What's clear is that things do change. We spent probably 2 years designing phase 1 of the downtown project. Probably started 8 years ago or so, and the board's position was not one parking spot to be lost, right? And now, I mean, things just change. So the problem with public construction is by the time you've constructed it, it's already changed. So while we definitely want to get going on the second phase, which is, it was from Dedham to Pickering or Warren, and from Chestnut to Maple or Linden. Maple, I think, is currently where they're at. We want to get going on that, but we don't want to do something. I mean, what I think it was Dan who said, this is a 50-year plan for the downtown. We don't want to rush it and then have it be obsolete by 2024. So we'll be here. This is one of our top priorities. Again, a great loss in engineering is really hard.
It'll be interesting with the train too, to see how that parking comes back. And the times is coming back, but
Yes,
we still
Yes.
don't see it 100%.
not in Needham.
Yeah.
The use of the train further inbound is much higher than it was certainly this time last year, but in Needham, it's not quite there yet.
Do we know why people aren't, is it the health thing, or is it their work requirements don't require them to be in, or something else?
Anecdotally,
Yeah.
the further in you get, the more people have to be in Boston than in Needham. A lot of people in Needham are working in remotely.
And then I had one comment about the parking, which is, and I think it's probably, I wouldn't say change the goal now, but being mindful for the future. One of the things downtown is the question of whether or not it's time to, or coming to the time to review the question of structured parking downtown, particularly in relation to the housing study. It seemed, 13 years ago, the downtown area was rezoned for mixed use development, but pretty much that hasn't happened. And in the housing committee, one of the answers to that so far is there's not, the potential developers cannot meet the parking requirements. And if they were waived, you would not have enough parking down there. So the question is whether or not to revisit that but I don't know that would really greatly expand the scope of the study. So I'm not saying do it now, but think about, well, how does it all fit together in the future, particularly because one thing that is relevant to this is we are allowing a lot of giving up of parking spaces for various other purposes right now, in part because people aren't downtown driving and needing to park, 3 feet from whatever place they want to pop into. That is likely to change as we get out of the COVID environment. And so we will, I guess it would intuitively seem that we may not be short of parking now, but we're going to in the future. And that again adds to thinking about bringing this issue back, which was before town meeting one time before and not approved, but it was a close vote. And again, maybe something was different.
Marianne?
So I do think it depends on how we think about local mobility. And right now we think about local mobility as being your car, but at some point I think we'll think about it differently. So all that has to play out. Kate, when you said this refers to also payment options, you're putting on the table there the change of meters finally to being able to pay by credit card and that kind of thing.
Yeah, or by
Kiosks,
by
yeah.
app.
By app,
Okay.
I was gonna say, because I
But
just
again,
remember.
It will be recommendations, it won't be the implementation of those recommendations.
Okay, so we are now the only community around us that doesn't have that. And I do remember the year I joined the board asking about that, my colleagues saying that I was insane to even be thinking about that, but
I would
we're now at
say
the point where nobody carries any money anymore, and
Okay.
it's a real challenge when you're trying to pay for a meter, so.
I would say that the study could also recommend looking at structured parking, if that's what they, that's, it'd certainly be on the table as something that could be considered. With employee and business parking, there's still a need for it, and it would only be greater, huge. The hospital parking in particular, right, is a
Right.
huge issue, so there's ways to work that out.
Is there, in this study, and I'm thinking of the zoning bylaw in the table of required spaces per use, would this study help give some guidance on that? Because you have uses in that may have gone 15, 20, 30 years ago, and you have a, recommended parking, or required parking for that. I would just like to see if we can look at that, framework and say, what, this doesn't really apply. And that might go to the idea of structured parking is, we actually need more spaces for that, or now that people are, like you said, more mobile, we only need one space per residential unit instead of 1.5, or whatever it is. I just would like to give that some thought.
Okay.
Yeah, just.
Yes.
If I may.
Kevin, please.
Thinking about the sharing economy, I don't know if that's still a thing now after the pandemic, but, and then do we have data on Uber rides originating in town, and terminating in town? So, all right.
Yeah,
Be
something the last full year, it's about 170,000.
175.
170,000,
Oh, wow.
right? Isn't that right?
Yes,
That's been
yes,
on,
yes.
yeah, because we got 17,000 in fees. Yeah, we have that. We can provide that to them.
Great.
There still were plenty during COVID too. Right?
Yeah.
Okay, evaluate the role and composition of TMAC, Transportation Committee, RTAC, and Complete Streets. So the board approved a committee charge, and this was a short-term ad hoc committee that will look at all of the committees in town that are doing anything regarding transit and transportation and traffic, and see whether that's the right structure or whether there should be different structures. Once that's done, then we can take a look at what then the next phase of that would be, either with the same committee or a different one. What is the future of transportation in here? But this is really structurally, do we have the right people looking at the right things? And if not, how should we do that? Mary, you've been interviewing people for that committee?
We actually appointed them at our last
Last
meeting, so they are appointed, so we can get a meeting scheduled for January. Get going.
Great. January is pretty busy.
I know, but
No, I think we absolutely have to find it.
Yeah.
Seek funding for noise reduction, quiet zone feasibility and design. So as we said, with the board the other night, and we have moved into
It
recommended.
is tier 1.
We moved the design and construction to tier 1. So we will be recommending this for 24. To the extent that we'll be able to do the streetscape project in 23, that's when we would be doing the work on the Great Plain Avenue crossing. So that is currently under design, so that it's likely that Great Plain would be first. And I'm looking at what the impact is if we're not ready to do the streetscape, whether we can still do the crossing. We have to make sure that we know what the design is going to be, though, so we design them appropriately, fit in with the overall design. So
Makes sense.
more to come on that.
so
Again,
Kate, there was some discussion on Facebook. I understand the source of not all knowledge, related to the use of an electric shuttle along this part, leading up to the junction. And of course, that would shift whether you need all the dollars for quiet zone. So I don't know how those thread together. There's actually pluses and minuses to one or the other approach.
My contact at the MBTA told me that electrification of the commuter rail itself is probably not in his lifetime. I think that major change to the MBTA's service delivery model is a 5 to 10 year horizon. So I don't know the answer. I don't know what the board wants to, I assume you'd have to study it and bring it to the T to replace, you'd have to find ways to do that. It's certainly something we could ask the T to talk to us about.
I don't think it would hurt.
I would like to hear from them
Yeah.
about it. I mean, I do think we have to continue on this track, right? But I would really like to hear from the T about it.
Agree.
From the junction,
So if we were to run the shuttle from the junction down to Muzzy, let's say for the time being, but so that transportation spine in town became accessible. All those places along that spine became accessible to people, whether you needed to get off at the hospital or the library or whatever, but yeah.
I would just caution, I know there are a lot of ideas, we've heard a lot of ideas, even speak from the MBTA, and I think Mary touched on this, but, I wouldn't want that to sidetrack us from moving ahead with this, because this is actually a known issue that we have to address, and I think these things are theoretical and beneficial in the future, but I just don't want to get mixed up in hoping for something that is, I think, a long way down. But I'd love to hear from the MBTA. But I just don't want that to impact
yeah,
our desire to move forward with this.
I don't feel that,
3.3, sorry, are you still talking about 3.3?
Yeah.
Okay, just want to be sure.
Correct.
Okay,
I don't feel that it would be wasted money anyway, even if you just did Great Plain Avenue. I mean, this, if you had a shuttle, it still has to cross all the streets,
Yes.
right? So, and you'd want that to be the safest
As
possible.
safe as you can. Right.
Another thing that that we're doing, and I got some great research from Safer Quieter Needham to help us out, is the infrastructure bills and whether that would fund the quiet zone infrastructure. Now, it is a little complicated because it's not our property, so if the MBTA had to sign off that it was their priority, that it might be harder for us because it's not their priority.
Correct, yeah.
But there's certainly, there is money in there for railway safety, so.
Yeah, just
Dan, you had a couple
just to
notes.
flag a couple of things. One, I mean, certainly there are a lot of changes that might be implemented that could that would affect public transportation and improve it and improve a lot of impacts that come from that. But I think a starting point that sometimes gets missed when we talk about the town should do this or the town should do that. The MBTA runs a regional commuter rail network, and of which the Needham line is one. They run it under federal rules and state and authority policies. The town's role is pretty limited in terms of our influence on it, although we are in communication. Any change on that line affects a lot of other things, including things that aren't even in Needham at all. So, and judging from the pace of change, when we've sought that in the past, even things that everybody is agreed on, and we would say, I remember this back when we were doing the rail trail things, people say, well, how long does it take to do a rail trail? The average is 9 years. So this is this is a little conversation that we've had right here.
Well, I did start by saying.
No, you're
don't
good,
change
you're
the
good.
goal.
I'm good.
I understand.
I'm
this.
just saying that people need, it's long-term stuff that
Correct.
affects a lot of people. So for me, I'm very much focused on the idea. I want things to run as well as they can under the existing rules. And while we talk about whatever might happen in the future, and specifically to get the quiet zone done. And I think Kate's point that those crossings are still gonna be there. And if whatever is zipping across those intersections is actually quieter than the big train, then the intersections had better be safe. So I think this sounds like a good investment. My specific thing here is I hope that we structure this in such that we move this forward in such a way that this year's ATM annual town meeting includes in the warrant article and an item in which we tell the members and need their approval for something that shows that we're making a commitment of funding and town government energies and bandwidth to doing this project, because we know roughly ballpark, it's a $4 million project that at this point town meeting has never voted on. And that is when we talk about the different hurdles to implement this. One is it cannot be done if town meeting says no. So it would, and the main reason that we would understand is that there are people who feel that that's more money than they want to spend. So I'd like to in some way tee that up, and Kate, my understanding is that it could be as simple as we're planning on using a portion of this coming year's Chapter 90 funding for the Great Plain Avenue. If we tell them that in the warrant description for Chapter 90, then when someone wants to kick the tires on it, we can have that discussion at town meeting. And if it passes unanimously, as Chapter 90 sometimes does, well, then we can at least have made that initial informational offering. And I think that puts us on a good path, because this is going to take a fair amount of work and a fair amount of dollars over a period of years. I think there's a lot of support for it, so it would be good to get that on the record. Thank you.
It'll be under a capital, right? In our warrant anyway, right?
There's no appropriation in 23.
Okay, so we're just gonna Chapter 90. Okay. Thank you, Dan.
So the future use of the rail corridor between Dover and Newton is a very broad category. So we have started conversations with the town of Dover, and then we will be expanding down to Medfield about what could be done to get access from Dover to our rail trail, including diverting, because the bridge over the river is going to be a very expensive component, and probably would be something that we'd have to get funding for elsewhere. When we replace the Central Street Bridge, you could have a bike lane that would divert traffic from the Dover side of the rail trail back over to our side. So that's something we're considering in that plan. On the other end, there is an earmark in the Commonwealth's ARPA funding currently in the amount of $200,000 that was started with a recommendation from the senators in Newton, and then with our Senator Roush, to further look at that the rail corridor again from Needham Heights into Newton. So this would be a very broad study again as to whether it's possible to run a multimodal shuttle plus bikes plus pedestrians. When we had a meeting on this, we had talked about what I understood to be the select board's priority, and I'm going to double check with you on this, is that getting commuters from Needham Heights to a future developed Muzzy site, even initially by bike and or walking, it would be a great use of that trail. Hope to get that piece studied. And then there's of course to get past Muzzy, you have to get over the highway, and then you have to get over the river, and then you have to deal with whether there's enough land for a shuttle. I think I had a meeting with the mayor last week, and she was asking about heavy rail, and I said, I don't think the board is talking about heavy rail or even the green line at this point. We're just talking about a shuttle. So I know what our priorities are, since everybody's nodding, and so to the extent we work with Newton to get the scope written, that's where I'll make sure we try to get that in. Yes.
Is the mayor amenable to a shuttle type approach?
She's amenable to talking about any options, yes.
That's why mayors get reelected.
Yeah.
And at the Dover end, setting aside the cost of the bridge, is there willingness of Dover citizenry to have that route used, at least from
Not yet.
To cross or not
By
yet? Okay,
Dover.
so.
Only they Dover.
Their project has not moved forward yet,
No,
but
okay.
they're working on several ways, including seeing if there's Commonwealth funding for trail design. There was some concern over the insurance requirements and taking on the responsibility of the lease, so they were talking to DCR about ways that could DCR take over. So the folks in Dover are working hard at trying to find ways, and we're trying to help them. So.
I mean, even if they didn't want to do the whole Dover route at this point, just to bring it from Center Street over the river to connect with ours would be a great boon to everyone involved.
I wouldn't want to ride a bike over that bridge now.
Well, no, but I'm saying something that's, I believe, because I'm optimistic, I believe that the fun, if we had the willingness on both sides of the river to have the route used to connect the two
Yeah.
communities by bicycle, that the funding would be, that there would be support for the funding.
But we don't have
at
that
state
yet.
level. No, we do not have
No,
that
there's
yet.
lots of ways that they're looking to try to get it done.
Okay, good.
Just to comment on the Newton crossing, because we had a chair, vice chair with the bike group. And the question was posed to this board, it sounds like multimodal is the desire, I think, of this board. If that's what I heard, right, to get over instead of just for bikes. I'm hoping, and again, this is a question for the planning board and the planners, when Muzzy gets redeveloped, that there will be some type of mitigation money requested or however that, and I'm not sure how it's done, but I know in these special permits, there are some ways to get money for mitigation or other purposes, but really to see if some of that can be used to get transportation eventually to that Muzzy site using that corridor. I just think that would be a wise use of money to help with transportation to that site, but it remains to be seen how, if that can be done, but that's something I'd like to see done.
Then that would be the old track, right?
Yeah, the old track.
There's an old track.
One of the
Okay.
things I did talk to the mayor and the chief administrative officer Newton is the Christina Street Bridge, and that is a high priority of both communities and achieves, a huge part of this objective is to get bikes into Newton without having to be on some of the more heavily traveled roads. And so we're working together to present this board with a letter of support, because I believe that trail it would be under the infrastructure bill from the federal government. It ticks a lot of the same boxes that other projects that we're trying to sell to. So Newton, I understood from Newton that their priority is that project because it's been designed and they're trying to find funding for it before they will be embarking on other rail trail. So trying to keep moving that one going. It is a great design and it could really help Newton residents as well. So then the downtown redesign phase 2. So what we're planning to do is, once we get into the new year, get together a stakeholder group. I'm not sure for, there has to be a lot of meetings, but just to get more input from people who are interested in the bike community and the walking community and the eating community and the retail community, and board and the policymakers, and just say, what are the current priorities? Because we don't, like I said, we have to design that, particularly the phase from Chestnut Street all the way down to Linden, which is the limits of eventually. It has to be done the way people want to use the space. And when they made the presentation to this board, and the board was saying, either make the sidewalks wider or put bike lanes, and do we need that many travel lanes? And so these are things we still have to keep talking about.
I think just feeding off what Marianne said earlier about, reimagining or looking to the future, that it's not just focus on driving, and making sure that families, parents, grandparents, and everybody have the ability to either ride bikes or walk and as safe as possible, incorporating that with, the quiet zones, and just making sure that that is more of a priority as we look at furthering this. And I think that is probably the best idea, is having stakeholders at the table that are more apt to do those things, and making sure that we have as much room as possible, for transportation if it's a vehicle, but more so for us to kind of, congregate in that area freely, safely, and having that, I think, is important as well.
Right. I completely agree, and I think we have to get drivers too, right? Because the reason we started this project is the
Right.
great frustration of the driving community that the downtown was just terrible for getting through. And it is a state numbered route, so,
Yeah.
but I agree, I think people really they want more pedestrian friendly
Right, right.
than it was before.
Well, and part of it is, at least it appears to me that a lot of the traffic that goes through downtown is not Needham people, but they need to, it's a state highway, they need to come through there. And of course, when they're stuck there with our people who are pretty frustrated. So yeah, I think to try to meet both needs, we need to
Mhm.
make it work for people that are in the neighborhood, particularly as we're gonna try to make it more residential.
Right, absolutely.
And at the same time, make sure that you can safely move through the traffic that's trying to get between Dedham and Wells. Points beyond.
Right, so we have to be looking at where we recommend people walk and where, through biking, it may not make sense to be, on Great Plain Avenue. If you're trying to provide, a 4 or 5 foot bike lane, both sides, maybe it goes up the street or around the street. So that, more to come on that in the early winter.
Okay.
I guess winter's tomorrow, but
Yeah.
midwinter.
It is tomorrow.
No.
Explore use of ARPA for public art. Our initial recommendation was $20,000 to support murals. These are being managed by the NCAC. They're on private property, and we have asked that we have some input in the design of what those murals are. So more to follow. Do you have any idea where they stand with those?
I don't.
Yeah, I don't know. More to come.
Quick question. I'm going back a couple numbers, but we were talking about ARPA and for small businesses and the $300,000 that we have allocated at this moment. If a business or someone is seeking for more than what we initially approved, is that something they're able to come to us before to give more funding in a certain area, or does that have to be readjusted and thought back out in that plan in order to? So say somebody, the max they can get was $5,000, but they're like, we need 10 and this is what we need it for, or something like that. How would that work? I just don't know, remember if we discussed that, or would it have to go completely back to the drawing board?
Well, you adopted the program.
Right.
So what we can do is if we're finding a lot of outliers, we can come back to you with a revised program.
Right, and I doubt there'll be a lot of them, but I'm saying what if, and how do we address
talk
that if
about
it
all
comes,
of
okay.
Yeah. Just on the public art and the downtown redesign, I remember years ago, we talked about incorporating some type of art when we were doing the redesign. Is that still?
So there are a couple of places where there's actually circles where there's statues, hold for statues, but they were sort of for the end.
Okay.
So, yeah,
For the end.
we have to, I suppose we could commission. Interesting idea.
Yeah, just a thought as we dovetail through the two.
Yeah. Yeah,
Great.
we were counting on donations for those statue locations. Mental and behavioral health, was already included in the proposal. If there's more needed, we'll let you know. We're posting the position in youth and family services in early January.
Was another commission?
Yes, yeah. And I think there are also some services that they're looking. Yeah.
Yes, you approved funding for both staff and services.
And there's also some funding in aging services. Over to 4.3, hiring, supporting, retaining diverse staff at every level. So you can see there's a couple of things that we've been working on. We've implemented the new applicant tracking software, which helps us eliminate unconscious bias in hiring opportunities. But we're trying to measure the diversity of the candidate pool that we're getting from some of the new sources that we're using for recruiting. We have created a survey for current staff and then included it for all new staff to create a better database of existing statistics. And then we've just recently released a survey for town employees participating in our employee resource group Stronger Together to determine how to strengthen that program. So that's a couple of things we're working on. We have been working since August with the National League of Cities and their race equity training that we're intending to provide to our supervisors, and we actually have a state grant for this. And the National League of Cities is so busy, they're not even answering our emails anymore. So we're either going to get an answer on when we can get that, because they have an excellent program, or we're gonna find an alternate provider, because we need to send it, we need to get it done this, in the next 6 months. So we're starting with our supervisor.
Okay. Yeah, Marcus?
Yeah, just a few questions. At the end of 4.3, it says provide annual updates. How do we make that more regular than annually? Is that something that we could do?
Tell me
Or
what
the
you want,
quarter,
I'm
yeah,
happy to
like
do it.
quarterly or something like that, to see if all these steps, you know, are quote unquote working, or do we need to reassess and figure out different ways to make this a reality? To like see this in the work that we're doing as far as how we're showing up and how we're staffing. And then you said there's a survey, and I just want to know, what are the percentage of staff eligible to take the survey, or is this for everyone to take? And
You
how
mean the
that?
Stronger Together survey?
Yeah. Has everyone taken
We
that?
send
or
it
is
to
it-
everyone because we don't wanna, we don't have a mechanism to send it to people who are in the BIPOC community, so.
Okay.
It basically says, you know, self-identify if you want to participate in Stronger Together, so it's
Okay.
going to all school and all town employees.
Okay. And then I feel like there isn't an overall mechanism, but I feel like most supervisors and people in those roles know who identify as BIPOC that work for them. If we say the numbers are really low and we're not getting those responses, can we push it more so like that, or ask why people may not be responding to this? Because if we're not getting any data back or enough data, how is it gonna get better? Or how, you know what I mean?
I do. We tend to try not to rely on people's personal view of who might be a BIPOC individual, so.
Personal as in their own view, I guess,
So,
yeah,
but we are asking supervisors to stress again, you know, with everyone, that to take a look at that survey for Stronger Together and see whether, one of the reasons that they sent it out is participation was lower than they would have expected, and so they're trying to decide if it's the time of day or the day of the week or that kind of thing, so.
Okay. And when did we start the blind personnel?
There's 2 searches or 3 searches now, so we've just started it.
Okay, so recently, so that's fairly new.
Yeah,
Okay,
I can ask Chuck to come in and, you know, March timeframe and give you an update.
Sure.
that'd be great. Is that okay with everyone else about having more regular progress updates with this?
Yeah,
I like it. If it was just annually once a year, it becomes it can become a thing to get through rather than a way to rethink.
Sure.
So I like it more regular.
okay, great.
And you want people to know it's a priority. too.
Absolutely.
All right.
Not a check.
So 4.4 is the focus on diversity, equity, including professional development. Like I told you, we're working with Wellesley and Westwood on that, and so if we can't, early in the new year, get a commitment from National League of Cities, and I understand why, I mean, everybody wants them, so we'll look for a different provider who's more local.
And then with that, would it be all town staff, employees and everybody that would take part of this, or are you suggesting it to specific groups to do these trainings and staff developments and things like that?
So with the towns that have done it and with the advice of the National League of Cities, their advice is to start with the group of supervisors, which is all the leadership managers, assistant managers, about 60 people, 65 people. And you know, that the best way is to start with the supervisors so that and then move on to rank managers. So that's the goal for the year, is to get the supervisors.
Okay, so the year is just the supervisors, and then how regular, I guess we haven't started yet, but is there an idea of how regular you would want these trainings to happen? Is this monthly, is this bi-annually, like,
I can't
From
answer
which-
that
okay.
yet, but I think when we get the training, we'll know more.
you know, a little bit more about it and what other people have done and,
Yeah.
you know, how effective it's been or not
Yeah,
been?
there are very few communities who've done formalized training, and you know, we're sort of following Arlington and seeing how their experience has been like and try to model it. Yeah.
Thank you.
4.5,
This is our community conversations on race.
Yeah.
Mary Ann, do you want to talk about this?
Mary Ann.
We've
Yeah,
been
I was
meeting
gonna say,
regularly.
Right?
Yeah, we continue to meet, and I think we now got a framework for our first session and at least some concepts for sessions 2 and 3. Started blocking out those and now trying to identify the right speakers and find a date. So we're looking at finally getting something out in the second half of the year.
And then as far as, because I know I missed the last meeting, as far as speakers are concerned, is it more so that we're looking for people that are, I guess, with making people feel comfortable? Is that what we're gaining more towards, or are we trying to do something that is going to not necessarily rock the boat in a crazy manner, but, you know, having people be okay with being uncomfortable and getting to the heart and the truth of what and how things have been, and not, I guess, protecting feelings in a sense, depending on who we have in the room or what may be happening.
Well, so I do think the request from Nuwari was to try to start with something that invited people in,
Mhm.
even though we're still tackling an issue that is a challenging issue
Correct.
for the first conversation. So I think we're trying to balance all of that.
Okay.
I think we're also partnering with NDI and the resilience network that they're creating.
Mhm.
And they're also talking about curated conversations as
On
part
a
of their
separate
work.
track.
On a
yeah.
separate
Okay.
track.
Okay.
Parallel in a sense. Okay.
But again, I would say they're also trying to broaden the number of people who are involved. I mean,
That's not
I
just the
think
same
both
people.
groups are worried about not having the same people who've been in the conversation about broadening that.
Yeah.
Makes sense. For
4.6, we're making direct outreach to community organizations. We've identified partners in community groups that represent members of the BIPOC community. We're always looking for additional ways, and I know when we start pulling together this year's list of committee appointments, we will be measuring, I guess, Mary Ann, what progress we're making, but.
We've made a little, but I would say that our applicant pool reflects a town that's still 94% white and, and we continue to be challenged in some cases with getting more women to step up for particular roles. But we've talked to everybody who's applied, and we've also talked to people who have been in roles for a long time about creating space maybe for some new people. So that was another thing. And it will take continued effort, I think, from this board to make changes over time there.
How are those conversations with some board members that have been on for a decent amount of time in their position about making space for a new?
It depends.
Okay. It's been a little bit of, okay, I just wanted to know, because I'm sure that's a very tough conversation for some to hear, or.
And some people are actually excited about trying to find somebody new to take their place.
Okay.
And some would like to stay exactly where they are for a long
End
time.
of town, got it.
Well, I think if someone contributes, you have that institutional knowledge, there's some people
Yeah.
who,
But I feel like those that contribute, that have that institutional knowledge, like someone that I know that is on their last term, like Mr. Matthews, they're not going anywhere because they're not on that board. So be able to be reached out to be, have access to, because it's not like they love the town any less.
right?
That they're not, yeah, you know what I mean?
Right.
So they're still gonna be
Yes.
around and accessible and be able to give that knowledge if people so choose to reach out. And I think that's important to establish those relationships with people that have served for many, many years, and then also have a new perspective of new people on the board that can also reach out, and talk to and get that institutional knowledge. Because, the last thing anybody wants to do when they leave a board is just be done. I think for the most part, for town government, they still want to be able to help out when they feel needed, and how we continue to make them feel like they're, all their institutional knowledge and all the things they've done for the town still matters and is still relevant, even though they might not specifically be on the board anymore.
There's another part of this that I think Miles and I have talked a lot about that I think, again, will be up to this board with how it carries forward, which is we've had a culture that said you automatically reappointed people as long as they wish to continue to serve.
Mhm.
I think that that's worth some more considered thought.
Yes,
So we've talked about a process where people could frankly reflect on their service. All right, I also had conversations with all the chairs about the people on their committees and their service and their commitment. Because as, you know, as Matt said, people do different things. There are some people who have been there a long time, but who are huge contributors.
yeah,
There are some people who have been there a long time, but who contribute less.
Yeah.
And in those cases, we need to figure out what that mix is. And if somebody is really there, but maybe contributing less, that's an opportunity
To
for
reimagine.
thinking about who might have more interest. So,
Right,
okay,
that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
Okay. right,
yeah,
I think it's good just to have those conversations. I think there's just a certain amount of inertia. People keep doing what they're doing.
yeah,
If you stop and think about it a little bit,
right,
that alone maybe makes an improvement.
yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Saving your eyeballs.
Right. 4-7,
Continuing Nuari, meeting is scheduled for January 10th, and we'll be working with Nuari on what their next steps are, and one of the particular items is what we've been hearing from boards and committees who have reviewed the statement, the Nuari statement, is how they can incorporate that statement into their work. So that would be a high priority for Nuari for 22. Encouraging groups to adopt the vision statement. 13 adoptions. So one of the things, you know, we put on the agenda for Nuari is for how they want to ask those groups, you know, why they're not
Yeah.
doing that. It may be better for Nuari to ask them.
I'm surprised it's just 13.
Those are the community groups, so not really our committees.
not the boards
but-
and committees, yeah.
That includes the board of committees?
No, Mary's right.
Yeah, those are broader community groups. So like, you know, the hospital board did adopt, but it's groups like
Mhm.
that we asked to consider adopting, so.
Question, or not question, comment. I know there's other towns that are reaching out, which I was gonna talk to Mary Ann about how and why Nuari was formed and what that looks like. I think Wayland was reaching out and some other people, so maybe I think, you know, rather than just myself or the reaching out to me, to have someone who was on the board when you started that whole conversation and how it's expanded would be good for other towns to hear, because people are very interested in Nuari and the work that we're doing.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to just put that out there that, like, you know, people have seen what we're doing, have taken notice, and they want to know how to sustain it. And that's something I think we're still figuring out as well, but we're a little bit ahead of some other communities that are looking for more information. So just wanted to put that sort of good news out that, you
We're
know,
going
it's being.
to Lincoln in January.
Okay,
I would be curious why, not, you know, we had a whole discussion at the Nuari meetings of the language and certain language, and even myself, as you remember, you know, some of it I
yeah,
didn't agree with, but at the end of the day, I think in totality, it worked. I would just be curious if some of the groups that didn't adopt it, if it's
you think it's
kind of a
language?
general thing, or like, oh, we didn't like this, or I would be just curious to get some feedback on it. Just curious.
I think some of the groups, what I've heard is that they are and have been, I think, predominantly white for so long. So some of the language or things that are in there is like, well, these don't really apply to us.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's what I've heard back from a couple of different committees, is that right there. It's just like, well, we don't really have to worry about that. But I think that's being stuck in a way of how it's always been and not what we're trying to get to. So I think, and that's most of our boards, but I think that's something to do with it.
Does this need to be systematized, our approach to this systematized in some way more than it is already, or?
I think we need to ask Nuari what they want to find out from the boards and committee, well, there are boards and committees that haven't adopted it, and also community groups. And I do think that it may be one-on-one reaching out and that kind of thing that.
Sure.
So,
It's
so
on their
we
agenda.
went out to the community groups from a systematized list, right? So we had a list of all the groups that exist in the community. I think the question is, how do we want to follow up on it? And that's what Nuari will be talking about in January.
Yeah, because I guess I would, and it's up, you know, Nuari can decide in the town manager, but it would seem to me that there's two kinds of communications here. And that they almost ought to in some way go either through some subcommittee that's delegated to work on this, or through the town manager's office, or have some staff support. Both for what Marcus has talked about, if other communities are reaching out to us, we need to give them a clear message rather than leave it to individual board members to do something informally. Because I think there's a lot of work there, but it was structured in a certain way, and we should be able to communicate that. And hopefully that will be helpful. And then the second is, yes, I do think that if there are groups that we asked to endorse the principles and they didn't, that we would like that we should know why, and that we should have a systematic way of finding out rather than, again, leave it to individual conversations.
I don't think we're saying different things. I think we just need to talk to Nuwari about how they want to approach it.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't think another letter from me is gonna get.
It's
the
gonna do
answer.
much, yeah.
No. I don't even think it's necessary. Yeah, well, I'll leave it to you. I
think
Yeah.
Nuwari is interested in engaging in that work also.
Yeah.
So,
You want to do it in a way that's uniform.
right.
And that I'm not like, because as we're getting reached out to, and what I've been doing is like, I've been, let me get back to you, because I don't want to come in 3 different messages to 3 different
Yes.
groups. If we just can have one simple way of talk the history and how it began and where we are now.
Yeah. I mean, in other areas, I've been involved in, there are all kinds of inter-community communications, but they're all informal and different people getting different information, and misunderstandings are easy. And that was just Park and Rec, something like this, so. Yeah. Okay.
Another thing we can talk to, that we will be talking to Nuwari about is if there's input on a question on our citizen survey that we'll be doing in the March timeframe. So that's on our agenda as well.
All right.
And then a follow-on, which will be part of the work of Nuwari in FY22, is to, what is it that it would look like to support board and committee members in terms of incorporating the vision statement into their work. So that may be, that will be a FY23 project.
That one is a one that's going to take, more thought in detail. And I think, whether it's the CPC or other committees that want us to come in and talk about these things, if we don't have a clear cut goal of how and why we want them to do this, which we know why, but it's just like, they're looking for a play-by-play.
Yeah.
And we don't have a play-by-play yet. And that's why I think holding off until we get something more substantial makes more sense. But I think there have been people that have reached out to us as the board, be like, so what do we do? Or Nuwari, so how do we do this? And I'm like, we're not quite there yet of how.
Well, but it's also interesting how individual boards and committees, when you engage with them in that conversation, they do start to generate ideas about how it does relate to their work. I mean, I had a very interesting conversation with the historical commission about ways in which they could raise awareness around various issues. And, so I think everybody, once they start to focus, they're actually quite helpful.
Once
in
that happens,
figuring out how that applies to their work.
Okay.
So.
4.11, the Human Rights Committee has a draft plan that they're going to be talking to the chair about in January, and then they'll be in to see the select board later in January.
Okay. And I have some questions on that, but yeah, you're right. We'll have a chair, vice chair, and
Yeah.
a quick thing.
Can I speak a little bit to that?
Sure.
Just because when it gets to, I know that there'll be, these things will proceed through many, to me, I've watched some of the meetings and seen that they struggled a little bit about trying to make sure that the mediation process is in compliance with the open meeting law.
Right.
And I can understand that, because when people come, most people come into town government not thinking that the open meeting law is for those bad people hiding behind the curtain, not for everybody, much less. It is for everybody. And it takes some care to both comply with the law and get your job done at the same time, because certain things that require that can be helped by candor and confidentiality and so on, that doesn't necessarily apply in the broad way that it did 50 years ago. Means people, but you're still trying to get things done. And I watched this, their model, initial model was something that's done in Arlington, where the Arlington committee is involved in trying to mediate certain kinds of issues that arise around diversity and equity issues in their community that are not litigation or criminal, but are problems that can benefit from being discussed. And I know our committee has struggled with the idea of how they can do this and comply with the law. And I think because if they have even two people assigned, those two people are a committee or a subcommittee. Then they have to publish meetings, and then there are limits on when people want to talk to them about a matter and keep it confidential. That's very hard to do because it'd be on Zoom like everybody else. So I think that the model solution, and I know that it's been discussed, but I just want to say, because other people will talk about it before they come back to see that this full board in January, is the idea of having an individual for any particular case assigned to work on that case in conjunction with a staff member. And then based on the outcome of that, maybe it will be, the issue will get resolved, or maybe it will be determined it's got to be referred to some other entity, or, but if it isn't able to be done in that simple and informal way, then that member can report back to the full committee, and the full committee can decide how to proceed. That to me makes a lot of sense, because you can kind of, at least in the initial phase, redact any personal information, names and so on, that might otherwise get into the case. And at the same time, I am convinced, both from experience here and from watching the Arlington presentation, that there are a lot of issues where if you had an informal way to get at them early, it would be a contribution. It would help it would help the individuals involved and help the community too. So, thank you.
Thank you. I guess we don't have to go over the debate this today, because I do want to hear from them and have a meeting on it, but I'm concerned about the confidentiality with businesses coming in. I know you have someone assigned, but one of the worst things someone can be accused of is discrimination. And if that then goes to the full board and it gets out and you're tried in the court of public opinion, I'm concerned how that process will protect people of either false accusation or other. So I do want to hear how this whole thing, I know Arlington has a model. There's extremely serious allegations, so I'm just curious how this is going to work so that it's fair.
So your example is like if something were to happen at a business and a complaint came in and it was false, and then that just ruins their image for it, or their reputation.
Correct.
Because we're in that specific instance.
Correct. And I think with the force of government behind it, it's very different being called in by a committee or a board if you're a private individual or a business. Then it has that extra layer and can be very intimidating. I think there has to be a way to have a discrimination process. I want to hear more about it. And I want this board to hear more about it. So, but I don't want to, we could probably talk about it for 20 minutes. That's
If we don't have the information, so.
right.
Yes.
We don't know. Okay.
The next one is the trying to find out the appropriate acknowledgement of the history of slavery. I don't think we've sent this to HRC yet because they're trying to finish another project. So we saw this as the second year. Remember, these are 2 years old. Yeah. Plan for use of ARPA funding for public health response. We already talked about it here several times. Monitor progress on law enforcement recommendations that she presented in June, and then the chief presented an update in October. He and Deputy Baker are working with their new analysts to create the annual report that we had talked about as one of the recommendations, and they'll be updating their law enforcement dashboard for calendar 21. I know that there's some conversation about things that we might want to add or make more clear. So once they've got the data pulled out, we can look at those as well. So I expect the chief in February, March.
Didn't we also see the chief in August? I believe we did, right at the end.
He's been in more, but yes, the most
Yeah.
recent was October.
So, I mean, it has been our goal, and I think it's fair to say to have the chief in every 8 to 12 weeks. He has been coming to report on kind of various initiatives he's working on. Yeah.
Yes.
Can we just make, on 5.1, and it said presented to select board in October, say, will also present in February or March.
Or,
I mean,
Or just say that we're keeping them on the schedule every 8 to
Yeah.
12 weeks.
Okay.
yeah, trying to keep it
Really-
consistent or
This
put
is just
something
an
in there.
update, so
Okay.
that's your expectation, I think.
I just don't want to have them come in if there's nothing of
Right.
substance to report, so.
I feel like there will be,
Haven't
because there's so
yet.
many
Yeah, as long as we're-
recommendations that we haven't, there's been as much progress on other things, so hopefully, we're making those.
Sure.
5.2, working on alternative to civil services ongoing or continuing that work. Meet regularly with other boards and committees. So one of the things we're talking about doing is creating an annual schedule. But we have met with several lately, the planning board has been, we had the assessors in, so we don't want to just have meetings, so sometimes it's helpful. when things on the goals to talk about. We did a Park and Rec in November. Working on deliverables from that meeting, particularly associated with trash.
Yeah,
We were with the chair and vice chair of the commission, and we found some bags that were illegally dumped, if you recall.
Oh, yes.
Together, so. We did 6.1B, we talked with the planning board about the brewery pub uses and the tree preservation strategies. One of the things that I was thinking to propose to the board is, instead of trying to create another committee or regroup the committee of planning board and select board members, perhaps find community members who would take that work and take a look at it and make some recommendations, because I think you're all sort of overtaxed. And maybe a pair of some fresh eyes of people who have experience in development and also in preservation. So does that make any sense?
Yes.
So what happened with the tree bylaw was that there was a committee, it was 2 members of the select board, staff and planning, building inspector, Parks and Forestry superintendent, and some planning board members. And they looked at whether there should be a bylaw to limit tree removal. And they came all the way to a recommendation, and then all the parties agreed that it wasn't the right time, it was too costly, it was too complicated, and so it's been sitting.
Okay.
So this board decided at your goal setting meeting in July, we really need to do something with this. We talked to the planning board about it, they seem to want to do something about it, but instead of getting the same group together, the thought is maybe to create a committee charge and a composition, appoint some outsiders to look at it and say, with inside staff supports, because everything requires staff time. And with the goal of, people feeling like trees are just being removed at a faster pace, and the value of them to our climate work and the value to neighbors. And there are other people who want trees removed and would prefer that you take them down, maybe at least. So we had a couple of instances where property that was seen as undevelopable became developed, and acres of trees were removed. And it's really, it's sort of like the next big house issue where people just, it's constant worry.
One thing about this is that, during the kind of the last few years, there are some places that have preservation bylaws of one kind or another, and some work and some don't. But the first step for this group would be, with staff support, to get the input about how what's worked and what hasn't in those other communities, and hold it up against the draft that was developed previously here.
Yeah, and we'll have another essentially 2 years worth of experience in the other communities too, so, of whether it's really stopping trees from coming down, or is it? You had a goal to meet with the league to discuss their study, which we did in November. The question is whether there's anything in that study that you wanted to take up.
I'd like to schedule a meeting, and after the first of the year, I guess maybe February, discuss that exact question, because I think there are committees that we could move for appointment instead of election, that they recommended, and I'd like to, what is everyone think of having?
Yeah, that's some other recommendations that we didn't really get into detail that we
Yes,
probably need
correct.
to, for sure.
Yeah, I'd echo that
Absolutely.
specifically the question, I agree 100% with the recommendations that the league made about selecting some committees for to switch from elected to appointed. I think it makes a lot of sense, and it's not going to be an easy lift, committees and offices, but we ought to get to work. We ought to get to work on it. And I know that we also had the concept of term limits in this goal. Now that I'm not running for real.
It's like, hey,
No, actually the other way. I didn't want to speak about this with me personally. I believe that my recommendation would be that the town not adopt term limits for elected offices, because one thing that happens, not so much here as elsewhere, is the elected offices actually have less authority than they did in some prior iterations of forms of government. And one is the fact that people know that so-and-so is gone as of X date. And the ability for people to stay, subject to the approval of the voters, actually is a little bit of a counterweight to that. And that's just my opinion, but that I would offer.
And I still disagree.
We can
So-
talk about.
Yeah,
we can talk about it in February.
exactly. Well, just,
That's okay, well, I'll be gone.
Yeah, we'll talk about it in February.
Yeah.
When we
and
get-
when we talk about appointments in general, just want to say that the process of what that looks like and how we're looking at applications, or however we're trying to appoint people and qualifications, and going back to our previous numbers about the diversity, equity standpoint for and what our boards kind of look like. And I think that's important as well when we're looking at appointing and who's coming on. And yeah.
I think in so much, it's gotta be word of mouth. It's just constantly asking people if they'll step up and serve. And
Like
when they say
annoying,
how they-
like annoying people with it, like in a sense, because we want
Yes.
more people, we want you to be a part of this process.
There's a couple
And-
people I was recommending for either water, sewer, and solid waste, and I kept saying it's 6 meetings a year.
Yeah.
It's not a big
bad.
lift, it's fine.
Start here, like that's, it's one on one.
I'll interrupt the meeting though to give Marianne a shout out in terms of the work that she's done this year, because a big part of it is it's a part of a system that's not terribly, it's important, not terribly visible, and it
Right.
tends to keep working the same way by doing what she's done in terms of expanding the outreach, by talking individually to the chairs, by reviewing the actions of each individual board member, and say, well, should we have some conversations about making some changes here? And
It's a lot to do.
a number, I've watched the appointments come through, and I read
Yeah,
the
no, it's-
resumes when they come through. We've
Yeah.
got some folks coming in that are not the usual
Absolutely.
suspects. And
Yeah.
More to go, but
But their last like 10 or so have just been really intentional. It seemed about how you've gone about your process and who's coming on these boards, and their backgrounds and professions and things. So big kudos for that, and all the work that you're putting to get that done, to be very upfront and intentional about that has been great to see. So much appreciated.
And the chairs are responsive to those conversations too.
Yeah.
So,
A related one, just go off again a little bit, is that in the old days, we used to copy all of the applications that anybody filed to be on a board and sent it to everyone. Through staffing turnover, that stopped. So is that something the board members want? We can, it's all digital, it's easy enough to send them along. Is it too much for your inbox, or if we put them in the weekly mail, what is
I'd
the?
like it.
Yeah, I don't think it's too much. No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is the weekly mail okay then, that you have to?
Yeah, the Christmas-
You open the weekly mail, and look at
Yeah.
that piece, okay.
I almost wonder if there becomes a private select board webpage. And if on that page, it could have a link to the server where Miles is now organizing all of these applications by committee. It's actually a lot more useful to look at them in context of who else has applied for a particular committee than, because I always felt sometimes people, when they came through, especially at odd times, they felt a little random.
You just get that, oh, got appointed. Like,
So it's really not until, we won't do the appointment process really again until the spring. So at this point, things could come in, they used to before.
Yeah, people do apply random
People do
times.
apply
Yeah,
randomly, and they would just come in, so it's almost, I think if we could get to the point where you can go to the server and see what he has saved for a particular committee, it's more useful, but
It's something along
What
those,
do you think of that?
along those lines. I like that, but also what you talked about earlier is how we're looking at talking to the committees and members that are doing more, possibly doing less. And what that may look like, instead of giving the automatic reappointment,
Right,
how that's gonna kind of coincide with this process now and how they're gonna work kind of hand in hand about, seeing and being intentional about who, the what, and the why. And is it time for something else? And I think I'm excited to kind of see that unfold. And if we don't have another appointment till the spring, is that going to be on the docket for the spring too, to kind of reevaluate how,
So
or
that
reimagine
is-
how we do that?
that is on the docket for the spring.
Right.
and The goal is to start getting that out in March.
Okay,
So,
okay, good.
Something will come up in the interim though, that needs a vacant, that has. a
Right.
vacant-
Right, sure.
And I just, my only concern, Mary, would be is if it's just that link, it goes out of your head, so maybe we do both, we put them in the mail. But if you see one for a vacancy, you might say, oh, who else is applying, and you could go to somewhere and see all of them, we'll
Yeah.
figure
Yeah, I'd
that,
rather,
we'll figure that out, okay,
great.
Yeah, having them just come out is helpful
yeah,
to me.
yeah. Well, sometimes board members know them and might, recommend.
Yeah.
The other question I had back to the League of Women Voters, is this something you're trying to tee up, or at least a placeholder for May, or are we talking May of 23?
oh, I
For,
think there could be a placeholder.
I think from May.
Okay,
yeah, for this upcoming, yeah.
Yeah,
remember the warrant, closes in,
You,
I think we should put a placeholder.
Yeah,
There's some
there's
things that I think are
some-
low hanging.
Low hanging.
so it would, some of them are bylaw and some of them might be.
Charter.
one
So a
thing
little
is
more.
that they each have to be, any changes that we would recommend, would each have to be individual warrant items, not come forward as
Yeah.
a group.
And Ms. McKnight.
Gene, I'll recognize you.
May I ask for clarification on the meeting in February that was proposed? Would that actually be a meeting with representatives of the League of Women Voters?
No, I thought it would just be an internal discussion for the board. I think we have the recommendations from the league, and then I think if we had any further questions out of that meeting, we would direct them towards the league. I'm just speaking as chair, I don't know how others.
Yeah, because that's what we just had the lead
Yeah, we
here.
just-
Yeah, I think it'd be a more candid conversation, just more of an open
Discussion.
conversation.
Yeah, I'm on the board of the league. so-
Oh, that's-
It's going to be a February meeting. Sounds good.
Yeah, the league study was, very, and
Very thorough.
a lot of us participated in it, was very thorough, but the real question is which of these 4 or 5
Yes,
switched from elected to appointed recognize are the ones that the board wants to carry forward to town meeting, remembering that the last time that we tried one that we thought was a particularly low hanging fruit, our recommendation was rejected by town meeting. So
Which one was
it's really, are you ready to do this?
The other thing is you could do some this year and some next year, some might require a lot.
oh,
more
God, yeah, yeah.
conversation.
this is-
Yeah.
Okay, let's keep moving, so I see school committee to discuss school transportation and bathrooms, can we?
The question is whether it's,
Which one? Sorry, where are
I'm
we?
sorry, 6.1D,
6.1D.
I think that is park and rec and the schools.
Is that something we already talked to them about? Did we already, and, yeah, Parks and Recs told us about, bathrooms and
Right.
whatnot last time they were here, but the school committee part,
School
or
transportation is
transportation,
really there.
what were we trying to meet with, like, what about that? Because I'm just trying to remember this one exactly.
There was
What
some
about the
discussion last
transportation were we trying to do?
earlier on in the year and at the end of last fiscal year about whether or not we should change, that the schools should, and that we should recommend that the schools change their funding model for bus passes.
To have more, or for the public, but
Free, yeah.
for,
Yeah, for
okay,
school buses. And I see that as a matter, it's a difficult topic, but it's clearly under the jurisdiction of the school committee.
Right.
If others want me to talk with them. And the fields, I think that the fields and the playgrounds are there had to do with the fact that some are still under the school committee, but basically they're
It-
administered under Park and Rec.
it was
so-
access to schools for bathrooms near parks.
Yeah,
Well, keeping the buildings open.
oh, okay, that's what that was. I got you, because when they have events on the weekends and things, and there was no bathrooms, having the
But Park and
accessibility.
Rec
to-
talked about the priority areas putting.
Portables.
potties.
Yes,
We just had to close Memorial Park bathrooms here, they did, because of the vandalism. So, until the sports season starts up again.
So you want to
Can we
call this
remove
one already talked about?
Yeah, I
or
think
Take it
so.
off or keep it on?
I don't see a need to keep
I'm
it
fine
on.
taking it off.
Fine.
6.2, we've been working away at making Memorial a place where you can have a meeting on Zoom. So and we have some ARPA funding identified for getting additional rooms, including Charles River, no, it's not there yet. A question for the board is when you might want to target, we need to give Mark Mandel enough, or medium cable, enough lead time, when you might want to move back to the select board chambers. I imagine the next 2-3 months is not ideal, but is there a plan to move, or you want to stay where you are?
I
I love
think,
the chambers, but
I think what's going on with the world and COVID, and since we have no idea what it's gonna look like in the next 3 months, probably no
Maybe
time
revisit
soon.
it.
maybe after the election.
Yeah, I think we should wait on that.
How much time did you say that he would
Couple
need?
months.
Yeah, I'm with Marcus. The idea is really, we need to be guided by the public health situation. And whenever you reach that point, 2 to 3 months from that, it'd be like a lot of reopenings.
And if somehow the health department feels like if we put a portable, I've seen some of these doctors' offices have those portable air circulators, that would help in the room. I would just go by guidance.
Sure. The nice thing about town halls, it's recently renovated, its ventilation system is
Right.
excellent,
Yeah.
so,
Just-
And that-
like this building, actually.
Okay.
Perfect.
Seek additional package store license, that's approved and filed with Representative Barrett. Public comment component,
Did that.
approved and
All set.
implemented. Select board orientation package, I'm gonna call this sort of completed. We ended up having to accelerate it, but after we adopted this goal, so.
Welcome.
We have Kevin here. Kevin can comment what he thought of the
So
select board.
Kevin got his new book, and then you all got it, and we would very much like feedback, when you have time,
Okay,
in, after the holidays to read it over, what's missing, what would you like more of? We tried to just have one quick way to explain a lot of things. This is separate again from the orientation itself, which we will be implementing for Kevin like we did for.
those are
Munson
fun. You're gonna have a good time.
With all the
You're gonna have a good
meetings.
time. You meet a lot of good people.
But to have something in place, even when you pull papers, you could get this document, right?
Yeah, I think that's what
Yeah.
the intention of
Would be nice.
the way behind
Yeah.
this when we first got on Lots for
In
myself.
fact, we will make this draft available. We should make a note to put the draft up when papers are, was it January 15th? Right.
Yeah,
Good, Jim.
yeah.
So people can read that, and then it's still marked draft, so if you have any feedback, and it will always be updated, but if there's something like drastically missing, that would be useful.
And then what we're moving towards is not just the select board, but then other committees, but this was the great first step, but to kind of just have more access and understanding of other, I guess, whether it's school committee or planning board or.
I'm not sure that was in our goal, so.
Oh,
I'm open to
okay,
talking
maybe,
about it.
hey, maybe I just thought that's what, maybe that was in my head. I was like,
You
yeah,
can have
select
it.
board. But I was like,
And, I think
I
the,
was gonna say, the
Yeah.
school committee has its own separate.
yeah, okay, they're their own
board,
separate thing,
so-
okay. But,
um,
okay,
yeah, but now that, I think some of the other boards do too, so, but we can certainly get it to our leadership team, and so they actually.
in
might be
one
useful.
centralized location, so people
Yeah.
can all see it, especially with our redesigned website that is gonna be in
Yeah.
the first quarter of the year. I think that'll all be beneficial.
Okay, so we started talking about,
I just.
Our
make
code of
up
conduct.
things.
Yeah,
we had samples, we had a bullet list, so turn our attention back to this in the winter, does that make sense?
great.
Yeah,
Community engagement, the newsletter, we have 2,500, we're trying to get to 3,000 in the very near future.
Great.
We have a great interest in our micro polling, so it's a great thing. I think in the future it will get a lot broader, but the way it works now is that you have to join the panel initially. You can't just randomly answer. So we have to get more people. We're trying to get using the newsletter to get more people to get on the micro polling. We just did one on what people would like in a library of things, and there were huge number of interesting things. People want particularly, what did she say? Baking, tools, those are the kinds of things that, if you,
Like baking in the library?
no,
Or,
they
sorry.
want, somebody who didn't have a room for a KitchenAid mixer. We want to borrow one on occasion.
Oh,
Or a
Um,
certain
okay.
size pan if you're gonna bake
Gotcha.
a
Yeah.
special cake or
Yeah.
something.
That is
That's creative.
located at the
Yeah.
library.
Evidently, in other communities, ukuleles are huge. So I
I can
told,
see music being a thing.
I
can
told the
see
library
that.
director, I said, so many people bought ukuleles during the pandemic. Don't buy any. I bet there's some out there. If
Yeah.
anybody's listening, they have a
Yeah.
ukulele. But also strangely, a stud finder is something
Really?
people don't use very often and they don't want to buy. So.
What's it called? What's it called?
A stud finder where you have to like hang a
I have a
picture.
bunch, yeah, I'll
Oh,
donate.
they all know
stud
that.
finder.
Yeah.
Oh,
Do not.
How about a cup of flour?
It's an example of the micropolling that we're doing it, so encourage everybody to sign up to get into those polls.
Good.
I know that one of the things we're working on is whether we can tweak it so that it's clear who it's coming from. I know that was an issue that Mary Ann had, so working on it. And the citizen satisfaction survey we'll be bringing back, so that's. I wish that COVID would start to wane before we send out our satisfaction survey that has ever been used. Still on it. That's on website refresh is on track. And we've renewed one of our 3 cable franchise licenses and we're working on the other 2, so. Those are mandatory items, not discretionary. Goal setting for future years, the board wanted to talk about, you know, when to start and how to get input from other boards and committees before you actually adopt your goals. I don't know if you have time now, or you want to put this on an agenda, or.
Yeah,
I think there's more
good idea to
discussion.
have an open discussion
Yeah.
on.
Maybe ask the other boards for feedback.
Yeah,
That's a start.
Well, and if we post it, develop some kind of tentative timeline.
Yeah.
Because we're gonna be, the board will be voting the goals presumably in July or August.
Yep,
So, this board should be thinking of how are we gonna solicit some input that
Between now
allows
and then.
people to have an opportunity to comment, get their stuff in the mix.
To be heard.
And then for the board to stay on what it needs to do as a timeline for the final vote.
What, April?
yeah, so we'd need something by
Yeah.
June probably, so they have to start talking in April.
Yeah, people need to know that they've got to get their asks in
Okay.
by.
I'll create a
say-
timeline for the board to
Yeah,
talk about.
Yeah.
right, they'd actually got to get them in by.
June
say,
would be when
the
we're
first week in
solidifying.
June. Yeah,
Isn't it
because-
June?
Well, you
They would have to
voted,
be-
you voted late August or July.
July is what we did
July,
last
August.
time, but I mean, if they're, June is kind of when we're going towards the tail end, won't we want that information be prior to June, so then that can help with,
I think you want to
finalizing it?
get your public input in by, say, the end of the first week in June, so that it can, because then, based on member comments and the manager's
Yeah.
recommendations, things
Then that
kind of
can compile.
condensed into the draft that this
Okay.
board will work on.
Yeah, and you probably should wait till after the election and then there's town meeting, so.
Right, oh, yes.
Oh,
That's-
so
that's-
stay
that's
invested.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
town
town meeting
meeting.
sometimes informs the goals,
it
right?
does.
Yeah,
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
like the Cheney Street one,
Yes.
is an example.
Fine. Yep.
Great, okay. Climate action, we have our committee close. Where is the committee? I can't remember, sorry.
I'm waiting to talk to you before.
Okay, Mary Ann, we're talking about.
oh, there it is. They're
We're
almost
getting,
there.
we're hoping they'll meet in January, February too.
Correct.
Yeah, and I had my one comment on that,
Yes,
which
yeah.
was that we had the resolution from town meeting on climate emergency, and really, that topic needs to go to climate action as part of its work in terms of how do we, the way I would frame it is speak to the rest of the world about how we view this in a way, and I'm thinking particularly of some of the problems that we've seen at the national level this past week. This is serious stuff, and we've got a lot of people that recognize that and they want to move the ball. Other people whose help is needed, they don't see any reason to act. And a lot in between, and how do we most effectively use our bully pulpit to enlist to get the message out in a way that people who we need to respond positively will.
I also think what the recommendations are going to drive, it, right? I think certain depends to me what they are, and what the committee comes with. I think some will be palatable, others might be a little bit of a stretch, so. Just be curious what the people with the ideas are and recommendations.
And then we are required to identify property to either buy or have donated to us to satisfy the land and water conservation fund requirements. So that continues to be on our goals and looking at ways to achieve that. We already talked about the tree preservation. So that leaves 3 things on Mr. Matthews' list.
And if I just
And
put
Anything else, anybody else?
on the tree preservation, and there is a parcel of land that we're looking at, Mary, and I had some information, but that has, trees on it. I think the way to preserve it, either the town acquires it, or again, getting to a town bylaw where a certain amount of, a parcel of a certain amount of acres, there has to be certain trees that be preserved. I think the benefit of that is local and direct and impactful. If we can acquire parcels with vegetative or forested parcels for preservation. So I just don't want that to be lost when we talk about climate and preservation strategies for private owners, when we can look at, are there ways that the public can acquire and get a benefit for them? So more to be discussed. Okay.
The senior circuit breaker that the board took off the goals.
Yeah, I don't want to change the goals for this year, but these were 3 things that I wanted to kind of put on the board's list to think about for future years. Just on the senior tax relief, we had done some study on a particular approach to senior tax relief that allows, in parallel, building off of the state circuit breaker, which is a pretty effective program that works in the state income tax, to allow parallel form of additional relief at the local level. It requires a home rule petition. There are about 6 or 7 that are in place around the state. And it basically allows supplemental relief, but also because the town still needs the money to do the work, effectively passes the bill that to the remaining taxpayers. It's a relatively small pass-through, but it's something that it's tax, which is serious business. If you put this back on, the next step would really be where we were when it went off, which is we've got a shopping list of the bill. We've got the kind of a file of the bills that were enacted in these other communities, and it would be a matter probably of having staff that can work in this area, contact those other communities and see how that program has worked for them. That would be the next step, and then to see if the town wanted to do something. And it comes in several different varieties, and you could kind of choose which bells and whistles to include or not.
And what would go to town meeting? Would it be kind of a skeleton, or would it have actual specific?
No, you would have to put in exactly the provisions that you want, because the home rule petition is a law that affects one town. It is passed in one town meeting, goes to the legislature, and is passed in that form in town meeting, rather in the legislature, and signed by the governor, just like any other law. A typical form of one of these things, which it would be, if you're a senior or one of the residents of the home, co-owners is a senior in a case of partners, and you're below, and you're at an income status where your property tax bill is more than 10% of your income, there's a calculation that you get an exemption equal to that up to a certain dollar maximum. And you would specify, in some places it's equal to the state circuit breaker amount, which is about $1,000. Others say up to 50% of the, which here would be as much, say, as $7,000 for a lot of folks. Those exemptions are total, and then the assessors and finance department does a calculation to allocate that. And there's usually a ceiling in these statutes that say if the total, no one I think has ever come close to this, but if the total is more than 1% of the total property tax burden of the town, then the exemptions are capped and prorated down, so that only 1% passes to the other taxpayers. That's an example. So the question would be, there's a certain amount of accounting work and applications and discretion and so on but these been in place for 4 or 5 years in some communities. Sudbury and Concord started, we're kind of the front runners on this. It would be time to find out how they've worked, and if they do, then you would be the next phase. If you find out, well, no, we repealed it, that would be another, that would be another. But it is time to find out. The next step is to look at the communities where these bills exist and say, is this something that would help here?
But your idea here is to put this kind of on our
Put it on the goals for
next
next year.
kind of,
This is your first citizen's contribution to your next year.
okay,
Put it in the goal list, but just as a reminder to the board, you already have a file on this.
Yes, we do.
It's ready for the next step.
So it's a goal to be on a goal.
right. Putting it on our radar, so to speak. Yeah, same with point of sale bags.
The point of sale bags, I'll try to condense this. There's a lot of argument about plastic and paper and what kind of rules you should have and what kind of thickness and the different arguments and the science and the costs and the energy use. The conclusion that I personally have come to is that the select board is not as always going to be in a position, because even places that have adopted these rules have ended up unhappy in certain ways with some of the outcomes that they get. It isn't so much for a group of non-experts in town government to specify use this kind of bag or that, but to really minimize the use of point of sale bags entirely. People shouldn't use them unless they need them, and if they do need them, well, then they should have reasonable access to them, I think most people would say. But, and the best way to get people to minimize them is to make them pay. And there are a lot of places, not only in the United States, but in the world, that use that exact system. You have to charge 25 cents, and okay, if that's what you want. But in Massachusetts, the rule is that cities have that authority and towns do not. So if you want to even have the authority, and I'm not actually, you don't have to buy my view of the thing. It's not even to impose the point of sale charge. But if you want to have that as an option, the next time that this issue comes back before the board, and it is likely to, then you had to initiate that process. And that's
We can debate it. I had a different
That's right.
point of view, as you know, Mr. Matthews on it, but
And he knows I'm 100% in alignment with him.
I know. Exactly. So I'm assuming, where this
To
will
be
go, but
determined.
I don't want to debate this today. But thank you, Mr. Citizen, for putting on.
That's it, that's it. I'm getting my
Future
citizen
citizen.
speaking. You notice I'm not taking more than 3 minutes for any one of these.
This is impressive.
And then the third one is Newton has developed a kind of an in-town municipal lift program that is subsidized and allows people to get rides that, to points to and from points within town. They've just started that program, and my recommendation would be for a goal to look at that program or others at other towns and see if they work. I know Kate is planning on recommending that anyway. That's why she got to leave. We're talking about this.
Leslie has one also.
Yeah.
But I
Is
just,
it-
I
Is it
had
an Uber
I
type thing, like
flagged
a
that.
ride? Like
It's
a,
not really Uber, it's more shuttle, but
Yeah.
okay, like
That
that
has
type of,
one too, yeah.
Is it routes or is it just like?
it's
on
not.
because you
demand?
call up, dial up, I need
Theirs
to
is
go.
on demand. Now, of
Okay.
course,
It's on
in
demand.
Needham, we already have certain things that the Council on Aging is already doing
Mhm.
for the
Correct.
private providers. So I don't know exactly how it would work, but it would just be to ask the question, how is this thing doing over there? And
What
is there
works?
something that we can learn from it?
Sure.
Great.
And I would say, I think everybody's learning with their programs, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Great.
okay.
Further discussion on goals? Yes.
Or stuff, I don't know if we're getting over our skis, but there's so much talk about like the Broad Meadow rooftop units and standards for AC units and heating units. The questions come up with the permanent public building committee needs language to say that a goal, we should enunciate a goal for an aspirational goal for like net zero building or code.
It's gonna come from the
Climate
climate.
The
action.
climate action.
That will come from them?
Yes.
Okay. All right,
For recommendation to us
Yeah.
to discuss.
okay, all right, then
Well, that's a good point. Yeah,
I think we're gonna identify things that we're gonna have to do if we're gonna reach
To reach net
our
zero.
goal by 2050, so that will set us.
Okay.
And then do we talk about at all what Marianne was talking about in the spring? We're talking about reimagining the boards, possibly having conversations with chairs and vice chairs about board members and what we're trying to do there, or is that already encompassed in something that we talked about? Kind of where you're trying to go, where we're trying to go with, you know, if the board members that are doing a lot are not doing as much, or, you know, having conversations about that.
Would be on the appointment?
Yeah, on appointments and
So
things
I
like that, or is that wrapped up in something
I
else
think
that we
that's
can put
part
it?
of the appointing process.
Yeah, just
Which has been different depending on which board member did it. I think, I'm trying to work with Miles to lead more of kind of a process behind.
You want to
some
update the appointment
suggestions.
protocol, maybe?
Yeah,
Should we put that as
Yeah.
a goal?
we could. I mean, that was.
That's
something
what I was
we talked about.
asking,
Do we
if
go
that's
look at
something-
the policy was one of the discussions Miles and I had at one point. Because, it's a little vague. So.
Yeah, we can talk, yeah, we can put that as a goal and then discuss what criteria the board feels is important. We might-
Yeah.
We do have a policy, but I don't know that it talks about chair rotation and things like that.
Yeah,
Dan?
Yeah, no, I think, you know, I do think the idea of institutionalizing some of these procedures that Marianne has implemented during her turn on this, on the vice chair's job. Because the policy just says the vice chair will interview and make recommendations
Right,
for
so
appointment.
more.
So Marianne's made that a lot more robust, and since of course it is the usual practice of the board to promote the clerk to be the vice chair, then hopefully you can participate.
Something substantial in place.
And remember, as can any members that look forward to eventually becoming. So,
All right, anything else? All right, is there a motion to adjourn?
So move.
so move.
Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
we're all in the room, so.